Hey Vikings fans, something is generating a lot of buzz, and it could change everything for our team. There are a lot of crazy stories floating around this time of year, but one of them actually feels like it could make this defense even more dangerous. Not just this season, but for years to come. And trust me, before you make up your mind, you need to hear all the details, because there's a lot more to this than meets the eye. Before we jump in, make sure you hit that like button if you're bleeding purple every single season. And down in the comments, type SKOL Vikings if you believe this team is ready to make a serious run this year. I want to see how many true Vikings fans are watching today. One potential move could quietly reshape the Minnesota Vikings' defensive future, and it all centers around a player whose name continues to surface in NFL trade discussions. While nothing is official, the possibility alone is enough to get Vikings fans talking, because the fit makes more sense than many people initially realize. The discussion begins with New York Giants edge rusher Kayvon Thibodeaux. With the Giants building one of the deepest edge groups in the league, questions naturally arise about whether they would be willing to move one of their talented pass rushers. New York already features Brian Burns, drafted Abdul Carter, and continues adding talent to the defensive front, creating speculation that Thibodeaux could become available if the right offer arrives. From Minnesota's perspective, the interest is easy to understand. The Vikings have established starters, but the depth behind them remains a legitimate question. Dallas Turner represents one of the organization's biggest long-term investments, while Andrew Van Ginkel continues to be one of the most versatile defenders in Brian Flores' defense. However, beyond those two, the current rotation depends heavily on younger, less proven players. That reality makes the idea of adding another high-level edge rusher far more intriguing than it might appear at first glance. Van Ginkel is not simply a traditional defensive end. Flores frequently deploys him in multiple roles, asking him to rush the passer on one snap and drop into coverage on the next. His versatility is one of the defining characteristics of Minnesota's defensive system. But that versatility also creates another challenge. Whenever Van Ginkel drops into coverage, someone else must consistently generate pressure off the edge. Relying entirely on developmental players to win those one-on-one matchups could become a concern over the course of a long NFL season. That is where Thibodeaux enters the conversation. As a former 5th overall selection, he possesses the physical tools teams covet at one of football's premium positions. If Minnesota were to acquire him, it would not necessarily be about replacing anyone currently on the roster. Instead, it would be about strengthening both the present and the future of the defense. Another important factor is Van Ginkel's situation. He continues to perform at a very high level despite playing through injuries, including dealing with a neck issue during last season. At the same time, he is now in his early 30s and has only 1 year remaining on his current contract. None of that diminishes his value, but it does raise reasonable long-term questions about how the Vikings envision their defensive front beyond the upcoming season. Adding Thibodeaux could provide an answer without creating immediate pressure for him to become the featured player. He could rotate into the defense, contribute immediately, and gradually develop alongside Dallas Turner as Minnesota potentially builds its next generation of edge rushers. Compensation is another key part of the discussion. Trade speculation around Thibodeaux has circulated since the NFL draft. Reports have suggested previous conversations involving draft compensation, with estimates ranging between a 3rd-round and 4th-round selection, although the Giants have reportedly sought higher value. For Minnesota, a 3rd-round pick could represent a reasonable balance between risk and reward. Paying a 2nd-round selection, however, becomes a much more difficult decision considering the uncertainty that comes with any trade and the financial commitment that could eventually follow. Thibodeaux is currently playing under his 5th-year option, meaning any acquiring team would eventually face an extension decision. That could become expensive if he performs at the level expected of a former top-5 draft choice, but it also offers an opportunity. The Vikings could evaluate him within Brian Flores' system before determining whether he deserves a long-term contract. If the move worked, Minnesota could find itself entering the future with Dallas Turner and Kayvon Thibodeaux forming one of the most athletic young edge-rushing duos in the NFL. What do you think, Vikings fans? If the Giants were willing to move Kayvon Thibodeaux for a third-round pick, would you make that trade, or would you keep the draft capital? Share your opinion in the comments because this debate is only getting started. While the Thibodeaux discussion is one that many Vikings fans could realistically get behind, the conversation takes a completely different turn when the focus shifts to quarterback rumors. A report recently suggested that Shedeur Sanders could eventually become available if things do not work out with the Cleveland Browns. The idea immediately sparked speculation across the NFL, and, as usual, Minnesota's name quickly entered the conversation simply because the Vikings continue to search for long-term stability at quarterback. However, when you take a closer look at the situation, the connection appears to make very little football sense. The speculation originated from ESPN NFL insider Jeremy Fowler, who raised the possibility that if Sanders failed to secure the starting job, Cleveland could eventually explore trade options depending on how the situation developed. It was presented as a hypothetical scenario rather than an indication that a trade was imminent, but it was enough to generate widespread discussion throughout the league. From the Vikings' perspective, though, the fit is difficult to justify. Minnesota has invested heavily in building its future around J.J. McCarthy. Bringing in another young quarterback who would immediately attract enormous media attention could create unnecessary distractions inside the locker room. Even if Sanders arrived strictly as a backup, every preseason throw, every practice report, and every quarterback decision would become a national storyline. Instead of allowing McCarthy to continue his development without added pressure, the organization would constantly face questions about the depth chart. That type of environment simply doesn't match the disciplined culture Kevin O'Connell and the Vikings have worked to establish. Beyond the media attention, there are also football considerations. The discussion pointed to Sanders' difficult rookie campaign, noting that Cleveland struggled offensively with inconsistent protection and limited offensive weapons. Regardless of those circumstances, the production raised legitimate questions about whether he is currently ready to become a franchise quarterback. For Minnesota, acquiring a backup quarterback should be about finding someone who complements the roster and supports the development of the starter, not someone who instantly becomes one of the biggest stories in the NFL every single week. That is why, despite the headlines, this feels much more like an off-season talking point than a realistic possibility. The Vikings have shown patience with their roster-building strategy. Rather than making splash moves simply because they dominate social media, the front office has consistently targeted players who fit both the system and the locker room. Nothing about the Sanders speculation suggests that philosophy has changed. The final piece of news involves a notable change within the Vikings front office. Ryan Grigson is reportedly moving on after no longer serving as the team's assistant general manager. According to the discussion, Minnesota offered him the opportunity to remain with the organization in a different role, but he instead chose to pursue another opportunity elsewhere in the NFL. That opportunity takes him back to the Cleveland Browns, where he is expected to serve as a senior football advisor. His departure closes another chapter for a Vikings front office that has continued to evolve over the past several seasons. Whether fans viewed Grigson positively or negatively, his exit represents another organizational change as Minnesota continues shaping its leadership structure heading into the future. Taken together, these three stories paint an interesting picture of where the Vikings stand today. One rumor presents a potential opportunity to strengthen an already aggressive defense with a talented young edge rusher who could become a cornerstone alongside Dallas Turner for years to come. Another rumor appears far less realistic, generating headlines but offering little evidence that it aligns with Minnesota's long-term vision at quarterback. Finally, the front office continues to undergo changes that could influence the organization's direction behind the scenes. As training camp approaches, every roster decision becomes increasingly important. Whether Minnesota chooses to remain patient or aggressively pursue additional talent, one thing is certain. Expectations surrounding this team continue to rise, and every move will be analyzed through the lens of a franchise determined to compete at the highest level. Now it's your turn, Vikings fans. Do you believe Minnesota should aggressively pursue Kayvon Thibodeaux if he truly becomes available? Do you think the Vikings should completely ignore the Shedeur Sanders rumors? And what are your thoughts on Ryan Grigson leaving the organization? Share your opinions in the comments below. If you enjoyed this breakdown, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the latest Minnesota Vikings news and analysis. SKOL Vikings.